the last panel. I'm very happy that you asked me to chair this panel because it will allow me to learn much more about the French Caribbean, which is not my strong side. So thank you very much for that. Reading your abstracts, I was impressed by the specificity of your projects and the way that it seems that all of you are kind of attacking a little bit the kind of sociological models of slave societies, plantation societies that seem to dominate the way you write about Caribbean history. Today we have three speakers, and you will have to excuse my French here. David Chaunu, who is a PhD student at Sorbonne University. His dissertation focuses on questions of slavery, the slave trade, and state formation in the 17th century French Caribbean. And today he will speak. His paper is entitled Slavery, Nobility, and Absolutism as Social Collaboration, a Social and Political History of the Longvilliers, Dyel and Hoüel families, slaveholders, and governors of the French islands of America. And that is in the early 17th century. We also have here Domitille de Gavriloff, who is also a PhD student, and she is at the École de Haute Études en Sciences Sociales. And she will present a paper entitled Orders, Wealth, and Whiteness, the Paris as the Theater of Competing Hierarchies in Martinique and Saint-Domingue. Her thesis deals with the evangelization of slaves in two French Caribbean islands of Martinique and Saint-Domingue in the kind of very long 18th century. And she's interested in questions about how race intersected with Christianity and possibly became a political tool. Maybe that was actually race emerging. So race became a political tool used by missionaries to maintain and reproduce slavery. And then we have also Fanny Malègue, who is also a PhD student at EHESS and at the French Institute for Demographic Studies. In her work, she focuses on the history of early modern colonial states and imperial formations, especially in the 18th century French Caribbean. And if I understand it correctly, you are about to complete your dissertation. Completion can be a long process. On colonial administration, state practices, and statistics. And the dissertation will be entitled The Empire in a Chart, Censuses of the First French Colonial Empire. And today, she will present a paper with the title Reading Between the Lines, Social Categorisation and Census Taking in the Slave Societies of the French Caribbean and after the 70s. And speakers have promised me to speak for around 25 minutes, and after that I will come a little more work. So please go ahead, David.
Thank you very much, Gunvor, and thank you to all of you. Thank you for the invitation to Melanie and Elodie. This is my first paper in English, so I'm very sorry for my accent. The history of overseas nobilities in the French West Indies and their relations with the French monarchy is a rather new topic of research which hasn't been studied thoroughly for several reasons. First of all, in those societies, nobility has often been seen as a social phenomenon less important than slavery, since the important works of Gabriel de Bien The historians who have studied European immigrations to the French West Indies in the 17th century have been concerned mainly with indentured servitude, conceiving these societies as coming from the lower social categories of French society. In the French West Indies, the idea that nobility and the society of orders hadn't been completely replicated in those new colonial societies was often justified by the importance of white solidarity against their African slaves and a supposed ideology of social egalitarianism between Europeans who immigrated there. Since the end of the year 2000, the only researcher, historian to have taken an interest in the ultramarine nobility is François-Joseph Roudjou, in a series of articles dealing not only with the nobility in Canada under the French and British regimes, but also and more generally with the nobility in the French Empire, the diverse modes of aggregation to the nobility, and the specificities of the French ultramarine nobility in relation to the nobility of the Kingdom of France. Focusing on the 18th century, Roudjou's work highlighted the specificities of the colonial nobilities, the diverse colonial nobilities. According to him, if the nobility remained an operative social marker in colonial societies in the 18th century, belonging to the colonial nobility brought fewer privileges than in the Kingdom of France. In the colonies, the nobility was early placed under the control of the royal authorities, such as ministers, governors, intendants, or conseil supérieur. While encouraging the formation of colonial nobilities in the second half of the 17th century, the monarchy sought to limit their political autonomy, preventing in particular that these nobles in the colony form new bodies, new political bodies, likely to influence political decisions in this territory. These measures would have, according to him, this measure have contributed to the acceleration of the redefinition of the ultramarine nobility in the 18th century, which seems to have sunk more quickly than its metropolitan counterpart into the mold of a nobility defined by the state. That is to say, a nobility based less on heredity and virtue than on merit, service, career, and honors granted by the monarchy. Yet, the second order in the nobility, the second order in the French West Indies in the 17th century, wasn't always defined by the monarchical and absolute power of the crown. For nearly 40 years, the French West Indies were actually governed by three important families belonging to the nobility. The first are the Longvilliers in Saint Christopher, the second, the Dyel in Martinique, and the third, the Hoüel in Guadeloupe. These three families all belong to families of a middle sort of nobility who emigrated to the island in the 1620s under the regime of the Compagnie des Îles de l'Amérique, founded by Richelieu in 1627, and which governed the island between 1627 and 1650. In 1650, this company sold the islands to these three families, who then became the lords of the colony, opening a short era of the history of these islands, which have been conceptualized by many Creole historians of the 19th century as a kind of golden age before the imposition of the authority of the state. Between 1627 and 1664, these three families thus occupied the top of the hierarchy of the island and established themselves as the main players in the political life of this territory. This family did not govern the islands completely independently from the crown, yet this small nobility group retained its power of self-definition in this period, exactly as in the Kingdom of France before the 1660s and the so-called Colbertian surveys of nobility. Last but not least, these three families constituted three of the largest slave owners in the Caribbean at that time, and their plantations and slave labor rivaled in productivity and numbers with the biggest planters in Barbados. Through the study of these families, From their arrival in the island to their exclusion from power in 1664, this paper aims to study social trajectories, but also to interrogate a set of discourses in the 17th century French West Indies that associate slave ownership with nobility, drawing a kind of derogatory boundary between gentlemen and commoners. I would like to show to what extent the formation of a colonial nobility in the first half of the 17th century was closely associated with the servile institution in a period when slavery was one of several labor regimes in this society, but it was also a regime that was nevertheless largely privileged by these three families. As soon as they arrived in the islands, the possession of slaves by these three families made the authority, because they are also officers of the company and the crown, and so because they possess slaves, they associate their authority with the authority of the crown, which coincided with the servile institution as a source of prestige, honor, but also economic and political power for these families. This link between nobility and slavery was strengthened from 1650 onwards, after the crisis of the company, making these families the sole holders of power in the islands. In this context, where noble families possess both seigneurial and royal power and authority over their slaves, the idea began to develop in these societies that the possession of slaves should be a noble privilege, only limited to a small elite in order to safeguard their economic power and prestige, but also to guarantee the military capabilities of these societies. And finally, I would like to show that the fact that the nobility was not a very structuring social fact in the islands after the 1660s as much to do with the royal will to limit the political autonomy of these families, as with the considerable economic and social cost of power for these families in these violent slave societies. So first, how to define the nobility in early 17th century France and its colonies. When our three families settled in the French West Indies, this question remained relatively unresolved, insofar as nobility constituted a quality whose criteria of definition partly eluded the monarchical state before the reign of Louis XIV. In the first half of the 17th century, where the distinction between the noble and the common was left to the communities themselves and not to the state, a gentleman was a person whose way of life can be defined as noble. This is a very vague definition, but this definition shows how much the accession to the nobility in old regime France was for a long time a very fluid phenomenon, whose criteria varied from community to community and from time to time. For many families of commoner origin, the accession to the nobility was often a long process, which began with the purchase of a fief, for instance, the abandonment of certain activities considered unworthy of a noble, for instance, trade or craft, and the purchase of an ennobling office. By the time they left to the French West Indies in the 1620s, our three families had all followed this kind of cursus honorum to be recognized as nobles. One way to be recognized as noble was, of course, to serve the king or one of his ministers at war or in colonial ventures sponsored by the crown. In the 1620s, the only thing these three families had in common before they arrived in the French West Indies was that they belonged to the clientele of Louis XIII's chief minister, the Cardinal de Richelieu. Under his government, the outbreak of war against Spanish monarchy had led the French monarchy to support the establishment of the first French colonies in the Caribbean. So St. Christopher in 1627, Martinique in 1635, Guadeloupe in 1635. These new colonies were placed under the jurisdiction of a new company, the so-called Compagnie des Îles de la Malègue. This overseas expansion project, supported by the French monarchy, relied almost entirely on the personal resources of the Cardinal de Richelieu and his faction at court. As in Stuart England, the devolution of privilege and governing capacities to individuals close to power was a way for the state to support overseas expansions at little cost. Richelieu was appointed as the first governor of the French islands of America. As a shareholder and director of the company, he encouraged his clients to invest in it, as he had done a few years ago for the Company of New France. These families, who established themselves in the islands in the 1620s, benefited also from their relations with Richelieu by obtaining gratifications, privileges, political offices, and access to the court. Sorry. Under both authority of Richelieu and the company, these three families obtained important political offices for themselves and their clients. In the 1630s and 1640s, there were indeed two types of political offices in the French West Indies, those that depended on the company for their attribution, and those attributed in the name of the king by Richelieu as governor of the islands. For instance, you have Jacques Dyel du Parquet became in 1635 Captain General for the Company of Martinique. In 1643, Charles Hoüel became Captain General for the Company of Guadeloupe, first type of office. And in 1639, Richelieu appointed for the first time is Lieutenant General of the French Islands of America, Philippe de Longvilliers. In the French West Indies, the formation of these new colonial societies saw the rapid constitution of a small group of families belonging to the local elite and considering themselves as true gentlemen. The criteria for defining this new nobility was both informed by their society of origins and by their new environment in the Caribbean. One of the specificities of this colonial nobility was, for instance, the possibility recognized by the crown to practice long-distance trade without losing their nobility. By virtue of the edict renewing the Company of the Islands of America in 1635, the crown stated that trading or investing in the new company shall, I quote, shall in no way diminish their nobility, qualities, privileges, and immunities. Some traditional honorary privileges are also attached to the status of noble in the colonies in this period, notably a right of precedence in public ceremonies or in the parish, but also the famous noble privilege of having one's head cut off instead of being hanged. The nature of their tax privileges was perhaps the most contentious issues, leading to significant tensions between these families and the company. Since 1635, the company had been collecting the French West Indies a tax called capitation, which is a seigneurial tax levied per capita on each servant or slave owned by each inhabitant to finance military expenses. But in practice, the company granted numerous exemptions in this period, practicing a kind of fiscal dumping between these different islands to protect fledgling colonies, etc. For instance, in Martinique and Saint-Christophe, the nobles benefited from the most important exemption for all of their dependents, servants or slaves. In Guadeloupe, this exemption benefited only to the officers for their persons and 10 of their dependents. And finally, as we know, in this formative period, African and Amerindian slaves were present in these new colonial societies from the beginning of the colonization. In the contract between the Crown and the Company in 1635, the peopling obligation of the Company only concerned the establishment of Frenchmen who are Catholic, men and women, to the number of 4,000 to be passed in the French West Indies in 20 years. But in this period, well, as I've already said, in the French West Indies, different labor regimes coexisted throughout the 17th century, However, it appears that from this formative period, these main families of the local elites always favored the use of slave labor, which they acquired mainly through foreign merchants, which means Portuguese or Dutch. Although estimates remain very sketchy, the various estimates that can be drawn from missionaries and travelers in the 1640s and 1650s suggest that between 69 and 78% of slaves were owned by the political elite of the French islands, which means noble person, gentlemen holding political offices of the company or of the king. In the 1630s and 1640s, well, this period was a very difficult time for this family and the new colonial societies. All the French islands were subject to regular attacks from the powerful Caribs until the end of the 1650s. Imperial rivalries against the Spanish, against the English, repeatedly failed to eradicate completely these small settlements. The early days of these colonies were also marked by high mortality, famines, epidemics. Yet the most important troubles came from those noble families themselves, who rebelled multiple times against the authority of the company in the second half of the 1640s, after the death of their main protector at court, the Cardinal de Richelieu, in December 1642. This series of revolts had little to do with slavery, so I have to go quickly. These revolts were an expression of the political culture of this French nobility, which saw revolt as a mode of political action to engage with the crown and to negotiate or retain political offices. These noble families often tended to regard as their own properties these political offices that they could pass on to their descendants, for instance. This series of revolts in the 1640s were motivated by the devoir de révolte, duty of revolt. This is an expression of the French historian Arlette Joannin. This series of revolts broke out in November 1644, following the refusal of Philippe de Longvilliers-Poincy to be replaced by a new lieutenant general. His refusal plunged the island into 2 years of turmoil and conflicts, during which these various noble families clashed between pro and anti-Longvilliers. Few slaves participated in this conflict, but after a year and a half of fighting and revolt, this series of revolt ended with the victory of Longvilliers, and the company, which was directly attacked by the Longvilliers family, was profoundly discredited by the local noble families and by the Queen Regent herself. So the company then sold its seigneury titles to the three families involved, putting an end in 1650 to the company's regime. So in September 1650, the Charlewell bought Guadeloupe, the archipelago of the Saints, and Marie-Galante. In 1651, the Dyel family bought the seigneury of Martinique, Saint Lucia, and Grenada. And finally, in 1651, the Order of Malta, at the request of Longvilliers, who was also a Knight of the Order, bought Saint Christophe, Saint Martin's, Saint Croix, and Saint Bartholomew. So, contrary to an old historiography, the end of the company's regime did not really lead to a decline of the crown political power over the islands. Instead, the crown had a very pragmatic policy. It pardoned the families most involved in the revolt, and the crown was concerned with allying these local elites, and so the crown places its authority in the hands of these most powerful families to defend its colonies. This led the crown to grant governors' commissions to these three families, placing seigneurial power and royal authority in the hands of the same families. It was also a careful and costless policy. By elevating these families to the position of royal governors, the crown relied on the personal resources of these three families for the defense of the French West Indies, at a time when the royal power did not maintain any royal garrisons in the islands. So for the first time, and for the first and only time in the early modern history of the French West Indies, royal power merged with the power of the island nobility. For this family, it was a great honor and privilege to succeed to the Cardinal of Richelieu himself as governors of these islands. Even more than under the company, under the company regime, the company had obligation to populate the islands with the Europeans. It's not the case with this at the time of the new seigneur. At this period, the royal authority was combined with the personal authority of those families, which was based on the ownership of slaves. All of these lords asserted their power by multiplying their luxurious expenses, having their slaves build vast palaces. Some of the slaves of these lord governors were used, for instance, for public works or for the charity due to the inhabitants. And I have to go quickly. So, at the same time, the social preeminence and economic success of these slave-owning elites became a sensible political issue between these lords and their vassals. We often interpret the demand for labor in these slave societies according to a liberal reading that conceives these transactions as market relations. I think it is also necessary to situate these claims within an economy of power based on gift and reciprocity, in which seigneurial and royal powers are compelled to grant slaves to the inhabitants. The inhabitants saw the ability to provide access to the slave trade and redistribute slaves as a duty of the lords towards their vassals. For instance, I have an example of this idea which I have found in an anonymous account of a cleric living on the colony of Grenada in the 1650s. In this account is called the Histoire de l'île de la Grenade. This anonymous author reports of the arrival of a new governor in the mid-1650s in Grenada, new governor called the Sieur Dubuc. Arriving in the Caribbean, this new governor stopped over in Barbados, where he was received by English Governor Daniel Sir. Before the French governor left Barbados, Daniel Sir gave him 14 pieces of advice on how to make a good colony and how to govern the people of Grenada well. Among these 14 pieces of advice, the English governor's main recommendation was to advance slaves from his own funds for the inhabitants of the colony. And I quote, "The most beautiful household that the governor can do in the beginning is to make all his efforts to advance some Negroes to his inhabitants, that it is his advantage in all ways," etc., etc. I have to go. This recommendation is interesting for several reasons. It says something about the power of seduction exercised by Barbados on the French colonial elite in the second half of the 17th century. The island's economic success, its early transition to sugar economy and slavery, appeared in the mid-1650s as a model for the French islands to emulate. This success was due to the island's ruling elite, which, writes the anonymous author, the French nobility of the islands would do well to emulate. But this quote must also be inscribed in the negotiation between the Lord Governors and their constituents, who take up the pen to defend their own rights against the greedy and predatory power of the Lord Governors. Indeed, this travel relation was written in the early 1660s to justify the revolt of the inhabitants of Grenada in 1659 against the said Governor Dubuc, whom they had executed after Mass. The publication of this text in France aimed to justify the action of the aimed to justify the action of the poor colony against a tyrannical governor. Among the colony's grievance against its governor, the author denounces in particular the fact that the governor wished to keep the slaves purchased from Dutch merchants for himself, and its principal officers. Access to slave labor was indeed a constant subject of multiple tension between inhabitants and lord governors in the 1650s. These tensions was mainly a problem of redistribution of slave labor, which was entirely confiscated by the Lord Governor for their own benefits and their principal officers. These numerous conflicts corresponded at the same time to an unusual demand from the nobility of the islands to the crown, asking for a royal intervention to confirm their social and political preeminence over the commoners. This noble family demanded the publication of a royal ordinance limiting the ownership of slaves to gentlemen only, and exempting noble families of the obligation to maintain a sufficient number of indentured servants on their plantations, which was an obligation for common planters. I need to conclude. This idea of these claims in the middle of the 17th century these claims were unanimously shared by the families of the local nobility, who wanted to keep slaves only for themselves as a privilege of the nobility of the islands. And yet, the societies of the French West Indies did not become societies divided between the noble slaveholding elite and common planters, whose economic power would be based on a workforce of European origins. There are many reasons for this. The first is, of course, the rise of the French slave trade from the 1660s. It allows a sharp increase in the number of large slave owners, including many non-nobles. A second reason is also linked to the failure of these noble families to constitute themselves into a powerful political elite capable of negotiating their claims with the French crown. This incapability was linked to the extraordinary economic cost of power for these families in brutal and violent slave societies. In a time when the royal crown hasn't based any royal garrison in these colonies, these families who had to assure the security of the islands, well, didn't have enough resources to finance the defense of these colonies. And when in 1664, when Louis XIV created the West India Company, and forced all of these families to sell to the new company their seigneurial titles, they were totally broke. So they couldn't oppose to the demands of the crown, who tried to reduce their own privilege. And I'm sorry for this. It's over.
Thank you very much, Domitille. I think for the first time went pretty well.
Okay, thank you.
But let's go on.
In 1734, a conflict broke out in a parish of the south of Saint-Domingue named Jacmel between the priest and one of the parishioners, Mr. Deputy, Jacmel's major. The priest's valet, in charge of distributing the holy bread and only mentioned as a Negro, gave communion to the judge before giving it to Mr. Deputy. And outraged by this violation of his privilege, the military officer complained about the valet to the church warden. This example shows the strength of tensions over precedence in these overseas churches according to rank and status. But it also manifests the participation of enslaved in the Christian ritual in a subordinate position, since we are dealing here with the valet, but nevertheless quite important, since he distributed the holy bread. The mention of slaves in religious rituals is quite rare in colonial correspondence or in local or royal ordinances. They rarely appear as actors in the parishes. And so this example raises questions about the position of enslaved in the parish, and more broadly about the hierarchical organization of the faithful. In many respects, as in the French kingdom, the parish was a central space in these colonial and slave societies, from a religious point of view, first of all, for the celebration of Sunday Mass and the administration of the sacraments for all the inhabitants. In the French Caribbean, a royal decree in 1716 forbade residential chapels and restricted the administration of the sacraments to the parish churches for all the faithful. And this was an important difference with the British Caribbean, where baptism and marriage could be celebrated privately in the plantations. The parish was also central on the military, economic, and administrative level. Despite the centrality of the parish in the organization of colonial life, this analytical framework was rarely adopted by the religious and social history of the French Caribbean. In her 2 articles dedicated to the evangelization of enslaved, and which are the most recent study about the question, Sue Peabody deals mainly with the relationship between missionaries and enslaved, but she shows little interest in the parish as a social space where slaves interacted as Christians with the rest of the colonial society. Since the 1990s, however, historians of early modern France have considerably renewed the historical approach to parishes by means of social history from the bottom up, by focusing on the latest point of view. From now on, the parish is considered as a privileged framework for observing the creation, the display, and the reproduction of social hierarchies in the societies. If such studies have no equivalent for the French colonies of the Caribbean, this approach has been explored in the context of the slave societies in the British Caribbean, for example, by Christian Bisley. In this book, Christian Ritual and the Creation of British Slave Societies, he argues that English settlers recreated the religious practices of the Church of England, adapting them to the reality of racial slavery in 3 colonies, Barbados, Jamaica, and North Carolina. And he shows how whites' control of seating and church space became increasingly racialized, which he explains by the growing racial anxiety experienced by whites in the 18th century. This is why I would like to cross-reference these historiographies in the context of 2 islands of the French West Indies, Martinique and Saint-Domingue. And so, how was social distinction expressed in these colonial and slave societies' churches? According to what hierarchical criteria was the religious public space organized? What was the importance of skin color, racial category, being a slave or not, wealth, rank, belonging to the nobility or the clergy? As a religious public space, parishes allowed in theory the gathering of all members of the religious community. And in the French Caribbean, Catholic practice about slavery was marked by a politics of conversion, which resulted from the beginning of the colonization in large numbers of enslaved and free people of color assisting in daily life parishes. However, the mass of the worshippers was far from being undifferentiated, but was instead divided along statutory, socio-economic, gender, and racial lines. Before going into more detail, I would like to insist on the divergence between missionary and administrative sources in the way each one portrayed the social composition of parish communities of these colonies. So, first, missionary sources mostly describe binary parish communities. In the first missionary accounts of the first half of the 17th century, when religious described their work, they separated the faithful between those they called the inhabitants, that is, populations of European origin, also called the French, and those they called the Negroes, meaning slave. But what is interesting is that from the late 17th century, in the 1680s, the missionaries, in the published as in manuscript sources, increasingly used the term whites to describe the French parishioners. This change shows the growing role of racial lexicon in describing social hierarchies within parishes, as the term white does not only describe the phenotype, but also refers to a set of physical, moral, cultural, and religious attributes, which were inaccessible to people of African descent, whether Creoles or not, whether free or not. There is one document which is in this regard enlightening. It's a report written by the superior of the Dominican mission in 1743, which details the proportion of white communicants and Negroes in each Martinican parish managed by the Dominicans. These are the 2 terms employed in the document. This report also shows that in these slave societies, African slaves made up the majority of parishioners in almost all the parishes, and it's important to keep in mind this demographic imbalance to understand how the whites, and particularly the slave-owning elite, sought to distinguish themselves from enslaved and from free people of color in their position in the church. On the other hand, administrative sources make this binary structure far more complex. Of course, colonial administrators also increasingly use the term white as opposed to Negro, to the term of Negro, but the group of whites appears much more diversified than in the missionary writings. Indeed, in the administrative correspondence, various conflicts over rank and precedence between members of the religious, administrative, and military elite regularly emerge. In the many rulings enacted to put an end to these conflicts, non-white as well as enslaved parishioners are always invisible. And this rulings shows that these colonial and slave societies were also all regime societies in which the elite claimed in the religious public space various honors justified by their rank and position, and they reflect a total acceptance of the principle of natural inequality. While the importance of rank and precedence has been extensively studied in the Kingdom of France by French historians like Fanny, or in the more specific context of the parish by Gavriloff or Laurence Croc, historians of the early French Caribbean have not paid much attention to these features of distinction among white parishioners. So first now I will present, in some detail the organization of the Christian ritual and the daily life in the parishes. And to begin with this first question, I would like to present a peculiar institution in the French Caribbean, which was called the Curé des Nègres, who was a priest dedicated to the black worshippers. So in the French West Indies, there was a clear separation between white and black Christians in the way the different religious rituals were organized, for the Sunday Mass, but also for catechism or religious feasts. And the institution of the Curé des Nègres was established very early in the Lesser Antilles, probably first on the initiative of the Jesuits, as early as in the 1650s. And the practice passed to Saint-Domingue in 1704 with the beginning of the Jesuit mission in the island. And it shows how this Lesser Antilles pattern was spreading to Saint-Domingue. Initially attached to the Jesuits, the practice spread to the other missionary orders as early as the first decade of the 18th century, with the encouragement of the colonial administrators. What was called the Negro Mass seems to be a more simplified version of the regular Mass and was not celebrated with the same apparatus. And this difference was justified by missionaries, by racial prejudice about the intellectual capacities of people of African descent. And for example, the Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Marga, in a letter in 1743, explained the holding of a separate mass by the fact that, I quote, the Negro, who had a limited intelligence and an emulation below the mediocre, requires that one rebase him in 100 different ways, and in their way of thinking, the first principle of the religion. The historian Stu Peabody explains this segregation as both a reinforcement of social hierarchies in these slave societies and a pragmatic way for the Jesuits to focus on populations whose language they did not speak. But whatever the reasons for this institution, it's certain that it contributed from the late 17th century to the effective separation of the parishioners between free and enslaved, and de facto between white Christians and non-white Christians. Indeed, these parish priests were initially dedicated to the enslaved, but gradually a racial divide was grafted on since, from the 1740s, we observe in the sources a systematic opposition between the parish priest of the Negroes and the parish priest of the whites. And we know, for example, that the Curé des Nègres in the city of Cap Français in Saint-Domingue was dedicated to all black people, whether enslaved or free. It's also interesting to note that the religious devoted to the black population received a smaller royal pension than the priests for white people, which manifests once again the hierarchy among the faithful. It should be noted, however, that this institution applied only to the 3 or 4 largest cities of the 2 colonies, Fort Royal, Saint-Pierre, Le Cap, and Port-de-Paix. And in all the other parishes, it's more difficult to know how the services were held, or to generalize to the existence of a separate mass for black worshippers. And in rural areas, given the few priests, it's likely that slaves attended the same services whites did. I will now mention how lay parish position contributed to the hierarchy between parishioners. So within the parish, some important tasks were carried out by the laity for the running of the parish. For example, church wardens for the finances, but also beadles, cantors, sextons, etc. for the liturgy. And the position of church warden was always performed by a lay person and was very respectable and honorary position. The church warden was the most important parishioner after the priest. In the metropole, the position was always held by members of nobility and bourgeoisie. This position could not be occupied by the enslaved because church warden had to be able to read and write, but also had to be rich enough to advance some expenses. But it is also unlikely that it was performed by 3 parishioners of color, although no sources for now allows me to affirm this hypothesis with certainty. The only condition which appears in the ruling about the election of church warden is that of the honorability and reputation. But some archives suggest that the position of church warden was impossible for Mesolite people, that is, white people married with a person of African descent. And for example, in 1773, when an inventory was made of the 33 parishes managed by the religious order in Saint-Domingue, in the 3 provinces of the north, the west, and the south, all the church wardens, except 4, bore the honorific title of sieur, even in the south province, characterized by a higher proportion of free people of color. The term would be forbidden to free people of color. The title sieur would be forbidden to free people of color only a few years later, but it was already customary to reserve it only for whites. And so I think this is a clue that all these church wardens were considered to be white in the colony. If I can, with my sources, I would like to make a more precise study of who were the church wardens in the French Caribbean. Concerning other parish positions, essential in the daily running of the parishes, such as vestryman, beadle, cantor, Swiss, or catechist, who were chosen by the church warden, very little is known about the place of the enslaved and free people of color. I would especially like to insist in one measure taken in the particular context of the city of Cap Français in Saint-Domingue, and without any equivalent in Martinique, which prohibited the enslaved from holding any position in the parish. In 1761, this decree forbade slaves to exercise the function of Swiss, beadle, and catechists. And it shows that some slaves could hold these positions before. This is a measure explained by the fear of giving too much autonomy to the slaves in a context marked by a growing fear of slave rebellions after the 7 Years' War and the Macandals revolt. And this same decree forbade all free people of color, all people of color, whether enslaved or free, to catechize. Some of the clues manifest the exclusion of slaves and to a lesser degree of free people of color from any religious office, which unfortunately, for lack of time, I can't detail here. Finally, the last point of this first part is the price of sacrament. And the study of the cost of sacrament is quite interesting because it reveals the prevalence of the statutory frontier between free and enslaved within the parish. But it also showed the importance of wealth. Indeed, the first ruling about curial rights, that was taxes people had to pay the priest to be baptized, married, and buried, established in 1671 2 types of churchgoers and provided that the administration of all sacraments would be free for the Negroes, probably meaning all the enslaved. We don't know the reason, but it was probably to encourage the practice of sacraments for the enslaved, and so that their masters did not have to pay for it. But this also meant that the sacraments for enslaved were probably administered in a very expeditious way, because priests were not paid for it. And for the rest of the parishioners, the main criterion of distinction was economic. There were, for example, 3 types of burial. and the price of each type of burial differed according to the pomp of the ceremony. And so here, the main line of division within the parishioners was the slave status, but within the class of free people, parishioners were also divided according to their wealth and social position. So the overview of these few elements lead me to nuance the statements that we can find, for example, in Peabody's article that the conversion rendered black slaves insiders. And this marginalization or even segregation of the faithful based upon their status and racial category also materialized in the spatial organization of the churches, but coupled with other sources of distinction, which I will now discuss. Yes. Indeed, as a public space, the parish church was a space of social competition in which worshippers manifested and negotiated their social position and were distinguished according to their status, racial category, of course, but also according to their rank, their wealth, and their gender. So first, the church seating at Saint-Demas. What emerges from the study of the spatial organization of Caribbean parishes is a moral economy of dignity and honors inherited from the old regime, and which David also talked about, in which their place in the church depended on their position within the socio-political hierarchy. Several rulings about precedence and honors in the church and public ceremonials were enacted in the Caribbean colonies as early as the late 17th century in the Lesser Antilles, and the first decade of the 18th century for Saint-Domingue. And the first conflicts over precedence in the churches appear in the sources in the 1670s, several decades after the beginning of the French settlement. The governor wrote to the minister to this occasion. These kinds of incidents are frequent in this country, and no matter how much attention I may pay to it, I will never be able to satisfy everyone if your orders do not solve the issue. So here, here is a table representing the major conflicts over precedence mentioned in the sources between the end of the 17th century and the 1760s. And we can see that this type of conflicts is very recurrent in the archives. In the French Caribbean churches, the traditional distinction between nobility and commoners was not as firmly established as in the French kingdom. But in the colonies, this struggle of honors was played out mainly between administrative and military elite and concerned the rank of each one in the pews during the Mass, during the distribution of the holy bread, or during the processions. These conflicts manifested a hierarchy based on rank and office, but also on gender. For example, women, even wives' offices, were excluded from the pews of honors by the 1713 ruling, and so they were excluded of this hierarchy of honors. The multiplication of these quarrels for the control of space between the members of the colonial elite shows how much importance the elite attached to the public display of their rank within the religious space. And this idea was, for example, expressed in 1724 by the governor of the Lesser Antilles in a preparatory memorandum for a ruling about precedence. And he says, honors in the churches are the things that are most desired in the colonies and that cause the most difficulties. These honors being greatly desired and being the only ones capable of raising the level of employment that one would not want without these honors. So I would like now to go into some details about the distribution of pews inside the church. As in metropole, in this overseas colony, the determining goal was that the social hierarchy was reflected by the spatial order, and in particular the individual's proximity to the council, where the sacrament of Eucharist was held. And some pews were reserved to some individuals according to their rank as an honorific sign. And for example, a pew in the council was an honor reserved only to the governor, the intendant, and the lieutenant de roi. But wealthy parishioners could also purchase a pew in order to display their social position, and the closer the pew was from the council, the more expensive it was. And what is interesting is that in 1726, in 1726, in order to put an end to these conflicts over precedence, the king decided to apply in the islands what was already done in New France and in metropole, to auction the renting of pews at the death of the former owner, instead of passing them on to his children. This is a sign of privatization of the pews, whose disposition is less and less a matter of rank or of family lineage, and increasingly an ostentatious sign of wealth. Historians identify the same process in the Parisian parishes, or even in the neighboring British Islands. I don't know for the other Caribbean churches. So the distribution of pews reflected both the rules of the old regime and so the importance of honors and the wealth of the parishioners. However, on this point, the display of slave ownership did not appear as a great source of distinction in the rulings. Concerning the church seating of the enslaved and the free people of color, there are very few clues left in the archives. As the enslaved form the majority of the churchgoers in almost all parishes, it's evident that the administrators had to deal with their place in the church. However, there is no local or metropolitan law that addresses this issue, neither for the free people of color. And this clearly shows that free people of color and enslaved were both excluded of this economy of dignity and honors. About the enslaved, I found some elements in the missionary archives. When they could attend the Sunday Mass with white people, it's clear that they had to remain in a subordinate position, either in the back of the church or with all the poor whites who could not afford to rent a pew, or even sometimes outside the church. And for example, there is a testimony of the Jesuit Jean Mongin, as early as in 1682, and he writes that in the Sunday Mass he was only able to let in about 100 slaves, adding that the church having been free of the whites fulfilled it. The other Negroes who had been obliged to remain at the door and at the windows succeeded them. The religious were also frequently complaining to the colonial administrators about disturbance and noise of the enslaved outside of the church during the Mass, so undoubtedly a lot of enslaved waited outside during the Mass. As for people of color, I only have some clues of customary practices. For example, in 1727 in Martinique, the lieutenant-colonel of the militia, Dubuc, in a memorandum on freedmen, proposed that freedmen should not be allowed to have pews in the churches. This proposal implied that until this date, some people of color could have pews, and it conveyed the idea of a racial hierarchy in this religious public space based upon the dishonor of the servile state. But it was not until the 1771 that this proposal was actually implemented by an ordinance. And this ordinance regulated the cruel rights it recalled the principle of auctioning the pews without distinction or preference on the quality or condition of the parishioner. But one article precise that, nevertheless, the people of color would only be received to bid on the last pews from the main door to the third of the nave. This abolition shows an increasing racialization in the hierarchy of the worshippers. And once again, one notices that enslaved were not taken into account in the ruling and in the adjudication of pews, which seems to confirm that they remain standing undoubtedly at the back of the church, or maybe some domestic enslaved may have sat next to their masters in the pews. Finally, through the study of burial places, we also observe the logic of the old regime in the honors reserved, for certain individuals. But here too, the interplay of wealth and whiteness were prevailing factors in the choice of burial places. First, the case of burials inside the church. Many of the prominent parishioners sought burial inside, making the church interior a memorial to the elite. And until the first half of the 18th century, to be buried inside the church was possible for any member of the parish, provided that they paid for it. And in general, the church warden conceded with the pew the ground which was below in order to bury the members of the same family. But this honor was first limited in Saint-Domingue in 1733 to a certain category of parishioners: governor, intendant, members of the clergy, church warden, majors, commandants, and justice officers. The rest of the population was required to be buried within the cemeteries. This prohibition of burials inside the church, linked to public health measures, was enacted in Saint-Domingue 20 years before Martinique, but also long before the metropole, in which the measure was taken only in 1776. In the cemeteries now, the study of the organization of brothels in the cemeteries reveals a segregation which functioned mainly as a statutory distinction between free people and enslaved, but which was coupled with racial prejudice, which led whites to distinguish themselves from free people of color. It seems that in the 17th century, enslaved were buried in the same parish cemeteries as the whites, or when the plantations were too far from the parish churches in some plantation cemeteries. The 14th article of the Code Noir recommended that masters bury their Christian slaves in holy ground, and this recommendation was repeated many times from the end of the 18th century and throughout the 18th century, a sign that the obligation was not necessarily respected by the masters. And in 1736, a decree required a clear separation between the cemeteries of whites and the zoos of Negroes in the Lesser-Antilles. In the majority of the parishes in Saint-Domingue, according to the historian Gavriloff, enslaved were buried in separate sections of graveyards, even sometimes in separate cemeteries. Some archival documents attest to an established custom of these separate cemeteries and to reluctance on the part of whites to be buried in the black cemeteries. And concerning the free people of color, it's once again impossible to generalize, to run practice. The study of parish registers shows that most of the time free people of color were buried in the same cemeteries as whites, but other types of sources reveal that they could be buried separately. And for example, the reorganization of the cemetery of Fort Royal in Martinique in 1765 led to the separation of the white cemetery from that of the freemen and the slaves. This measure is taken in the 1760s, signals once again the growing exclusion of free people of color, and that an institutional racialization which was more and more prevalent in the organization of places of worship and places of burial. So to conclude, as shown by the first study of the organization of Christian ritual, but also the distribution of positions in the vestries, these societies were definitely, first of all, slave societies, in which the divide between the free and enslaved was prevailing in the perpetuation of social order, and in which racial distinction increasingly pit whites against non-whites in religious public space during the 18th century. But as many archives tell us, spatial organization of the churches clearly shows that metropolitan or regime hierarchies continued being of the utmost importance within the parish space, and maybe more than slave ownership or between white people or even the racial divide. So the participation of the faithful of African origin in Catholic ritual did lead to the reinforcement of social-racial hierarchies. This does not mean that this racial vision of the social order did totally erase all of the criteria of domination and in particular the traditional hierarchies of the old regime in France. Thank you.
So, on the 5th of December 1763, the Marquis de Fénon, governor of the Caribbean island of Martinique, and Le Mercier de la Rivière, who retained the office of intendant, issued an ordinance to prescribe the holding of the annual census of the colony and its dependent territories. In bit and substance, there is nothing special about this order, since one can trace back the same demands as far as 1635. As early as the 1660s, it became assumed that the local colonial administrators, governors, and intendants, both in New France or in the Caribbean, had to send every year to Versailles an extensive census of the population of the colony they governed. In turn, the central administration would periodically remind the local administrators what they expected out of the process, or ask them to modify it slightly depending on the fiscal or administrative reforms the Crown wanted to enforce. Beyond their very zealous and mundane wording, the two Martinique administrators are in fact trying to hide their concerns regarding the situation of the French colonial empire at the end of 1763. The Paris Treaty, marking the end of the 7 Years' War, was signed less than a year before, when Fénon and Le Mercier de la Rivière issued the ordinance calling for the enumeration of the population, cattle, and means of production and defense of Martinique. The war that broke out in 1756 both in Europe and in the Atlantic world, not only triggered major financial hardship, but also eventually ended bitterly for France. A profound political crisis arose in the aftermath of the war, making reforms extremely necessary. The colony of Canada, France's larger colony before the war, was lost for the benefit of Britain, and after 1763, my global currency is gone. Okay, yeah. After 1763, France thus held only a couple of island colonies where slavery was established in the Antilles and the Mascarene Archipelago, and trading posts on the shores of Africa and India. But it was not all doom and gloom, since the economic environment was extremely beneficial at the time. The production and trade of colonial commodities, relying on survived workforce, was rising dramatically in the middle of the 18th century. For the Crown and its imperial administrators, the challenge was to manage to take advantage of this favorable climate by reorganizing the empire and by enforcing reforms that would help to maintain the French presence overseas, which was diplomatically and economically crucial. So, once the colonial states recovered the territories that were occupied by Britain during the war, one was actually taken in 1759, while Martinique fell in 1762. One of the first decisions, among others, of course, is to revive the long-used practice of census. This immediate recourse to census is hardly surprising. Population and demographic question turned out to be more crucial than ever in the aftermath of the conflict. On the one hand, in the Caribbean, the plantation economy was supported by the steady supply of African captives, and those slave societies, Saint-Domingue above all, were especially deadly to the enslaved people. On the other hand, the production and trade of colonial commodities represented a financial manna that attracted greedy metropolitan migrants who were eager to try their luck by becoming sugar or coffee planters. While trade and production rose significantly during the second half of the 18th century, the population of free people of color grew significantly while trade and production rose significantly during the second half of the 18th century, the population of free people of color grew as well, as did the numerical imbalance between the white and black population. This demographic issue sowed a seed of racial tensions that would be aggravating as time goes by. In such a context, where issues regarding population have never been so critical, the colonial administrators who had stopped sending censuses during the war chose to revive the practice in the Antilles and in Guyana. The most important issue was that the normal running of the state resumed as soon as possible, and in particular, tax collection. It is therefore not surprising to have the administrators conducting population enumerations upon which the tax basis will be calculated. In Martinique, reforms were even more crucial since the British occupation was permitted after a quick military surrender and a strong backing from the planters themselves. As in Guadeloupe, the planters were very eager to give in and were readily coping with the English occupation. The loyalty of the settlers was thereupon called into question by the central power. The British occupation, though it was very short, 17 months in total, could have been seen as a relief. It meant the end of a very long naval blockade, and above all, the arrival of the British marked the disappearance of the French exclusive regime. It was the promise of a valuable upturn for their economic activities. The Marquis de Fénelon is appointed governor of Martinique once the island was officially returned to France by the British authorities. Upon his arrival in the islands, he notes that the military defeat in 1762 was caused by the, quote, Grand Blanc, wealthy planters, of the island, and in particular the Dubuc family. Fénelon's letter to the ministers are filled with observations and information on the temper, the attitude, or, quote, the rebellious spirit of the Dubucs, both in Martinique and in Paris. In reality, the Chamber of Agriculture of Martinique had just proclaimed itself Assemblée des États de la Martinique, meaning Assembly of Martinique, therefore trampling over the authority of the intendant who was just back on the island. Authorities in the colony and in Versailles were worried that the planters would soon express the desire to carry out a political reform. So the moment of the census was in fact ideal for the local authorities to try to dismantle, at least temporarily, this uneasy situation. In an ordinance from the month of March 1763, the king had given to the intendants of the colony the same duties as the one that were in charge of the provinces in the kingdom. It meant, among other things, that municipal officers were to be elected in each parish according to the model of the Marguilliers or syndic in France. They were charged in each colony with housing troops, organizing the corvée service, supplying the army with carriages and cattle, but also conducting censuses. It was applied in Martinique in October 1760. But the preamble of the ordinance taken in by Martinique administrators mentioned that, quote, the maintenance of order and of public law has made necessary the establishment of some parish superintendent. We have believed good to give those functions to the one of the inhabitants as designated among them under the British rule to fulfill the same duties. So in fact, it seems that those representatives elected and by and among the planters during the British occupation never really ceased to exercise their authority locally. The administrators managed wisely to give them new prerogatives related to parish administrations with the hope to quench their thirst for political representation within the colonies and maybe even in Versailles. The name of the elected planters and their lieutenants in Martinique are then sent to the minister as soon as August 1763 with the copy of a model of the commissions they were to receive from the hands of the local administration. It seems that the central administration in Versailles did not revoke any of the elected planters, but that the fact that the names were transmitted for Martinique and not for the other colonies shows that the real anxieties were born from the British occupation of the island. The planters who were elected are very well known and rooted on the territories they have authority. They are also at the very heart of local patronage networks. It is, for example, the case of the elected planter in the parish of Tartane, who is as well a member of the Dubuc family. His name is Dubuc du Gallon. And Fanny later writes about his anxiety about this family's sprawling network, insisting on the fact that, quote, this family is hereditary an enemy of the government because it's pro-Britain, Republican, and unsympathetic with any kind of authority. So from the very peculiar situation in Martinique will therefore be born a new census process, which tends to be much more rigid and controlled. Between July 1763 and the month of December of the same year, the administrators of Martinique issues no less than 5 ordinances regarding censuses and the census process, while in Saint-Domingue there was only one. And Article 3 of the instruction given by the intendant to the new elected parish officer confirmed this idea by asking that, quote, the inhabitants add after their name in the census and the one of their wives and children, whether they are Creole or European. And this is quite remarkable to note that for the first time since censuses were used in the French colonial empire, the column of the chart listing the number for the white population is divided in two between Creoles and Europeans, therefore underlining explicitly the distrust of the authorities towards Martinique's planters. It is even more remarkable as after the 1720s, the main categories used in the final charts sent to Versailles are no longer modified. The category of white indentured servants or domestiques blancs disappears slowly during the decade, while the one of free people of color is added to the charts. The same ordinance explains step by step how the data is supposed to be collected. The process is deeply modified and institutionalized. In the past, the numbers were gathered roughly during the annual review of the garrison militia. After 1763, numbers must be declared and established on the basis of what was declared the year before. The deaths have to be deducted from the number, while the births of the year or new arrivals have to be added. Inhabitants have to go themselves to the parish house to draw, sign, and certify the declaration in front of parish officers. Frauds and breaches are severely punished by a fine of 500 livres and the seizures of undeclared slaves. Planters who refuse to submit themselves to the census are called, quote, disobedient and offenders, and the authorities threaten them to have themselves arrested and put to jail. So the reform implemented on colonial administration right after the end of the 7 Years' War is visible within the census process itself, but also in the uses made of the census number. Many administrative processes are merged into the one of the census. The inhabitants have provide the administration with one single census document, and we have two examples here, which is later used for different purposes, whether it's for the roads management or the division of the land, for an economic account, or the annual charge required by the king, for the establishment of diverse local and colonial-wide tax bases. A sole census document then allows the administration to enforce a large range of actions, especially at the local level. And it was especially crucial for the caisse des nègres justiciers, which is a local rent system that allowed masters to be repaid the price of their slaves in case they were sentenced to death by judicial authorities. So the annual chart sent to the Bureau d'économie, here you have the example for Martinique in 1788. So the Bureau d'économie is located in Versailles. It becomes then only one of the many administrative products derived from the censuses. Census operations are not anymore conducted to only know the number of people in a given colony for a given year. The fact that this administrative tool was not only used in slaves, was now only used in slave societies modifies deeply its meaning. The census process, which was reactivated very quickly after the end of the war, crystallizes the tensions born from the war and its defeat, and goes beyond the sole enumeration of people. The Minister of the Marine sends his comments in return and continues to use after the war the chart of population to govern remote colonies. But census also became a tool to control the planters and the slaves, and a negotiation process between the royal power and the colonial society. Censuses represented a convenient way for the crown to highlight its sovereignty over the empire, as well as a suitable mediation instrument to govern its relationship with its remote subjects and to regulate slavery. It was, for example, used to implement the only direct tax paid by slave owners to the crown based on the number of slaves they own. Because of this peculiar link between census and taxation, which is far from uncommon actually, the numbers are inaccurate. Planters would, for example, lie on the disability of their slaves, declaring that they owned many slaves that were unable to work in the field, as the disabled and elderly slaves were taxed up to 50% less. In the worst-case scenario, they either declared the number of the slaves they own or intentionally beat and wound them to make them pass for disabled at the time of the census. So it is very difficult to estimate precisely how common those frauds were, but one can safely argue that they were very, very frequent. But the Crown is highly aware of that and looks for an estimation rather than an exact number of the population within the census chart. Scientific accuracy is not what is at stake here. For the colonial administration, the census provides much more than a rough number. It allows, for example, agents of the crown or surgeons to penetrate into the plantations to verify the numbers of slaves declared by the master, which is a very, very rare intrusion of the state within the planter's domesticity and the slave-master relationship. The frauds in the planter's declaration are severely punished, but the management of the census itself is left to local major planters in each parish. The effect being that the census is a social event or moment where local hierarchies and privileges are negotiated and regulated within the parish itself. And indeed, the planters' declaration are made public in the 1780s. During the census process, a list of the slaves declared by the planters is displayed in the room where the parochial assembly is held. The names of the planters who committed fraud are shown on the church doors, and the planters' neighbors are called to verify and certify the declarations. Copies of the individual declarations were also handed out to planters every year and used by them to reclaim captured runaway slaves and prove their ownership and tax exemptions. The Crown also used the census process to proclaim its sovereignty over regained territories. The moment the census is taken is therefore being the moment of the return to peace and actual administrative normality. Thus, when Tobago became French again in 1781, the administration is modeled on Martinique, which at the time played the role of the colonial central administration. Once the conquest is over in 1784, a census is made in Tobago on the very exact models of Martinique. So this formalization and standardization of the census process reveals also internal tensions within the empire. On the 8th of March 1781, the Minister of the Marine requests that the civil government of the island of Grenada be placed under the authority of the one of Martinique. This decision follows the shipment of the census of the island by the Commissaire Ordinateur Le Mort directly to the minister himself, therefore ousting the colonial administration of Martinique. The fact that the administrators of Grenada continue to ship mails and communicate directly with the minister is seen as a movement of rebellion by the local colonial elites defending the independence of the island against the administrative supervision of Martinique. So while in the kingdom, attempts to enumerate the population raised so many opposition that the first actual global census of all metropolitan France is only taken in 1801 during the rule of Napoleon, and despite several earlier attempts, in the Caribbean colonies, censuses did ironically never foster a revolt or an uprising, while the historiography tends to underline the fact that the white settlers were very easily revolting against royal decisions, especially in Martinique and in Saint-Domingue. It can be explained by the fact that counterpowers were maybe less important in the colonies as the church was weak and the municipal power non-existent. It can also be explained by the fact that the census was a powerful tool of negotiation for the crown with its subjects. In fact, the whole of the actual population was not shown on the census chart. People that were unsettled, so marine officers, soldiers, therefore not belonging in the project of the settlers colony, or people that did not fit in the pictures like runaway slaves, bad and unfaithful subjects, were either listed nominatively apart or not even counted. Territories that were not considered as colonies, Indian and African trading posts, were also not included into the census process, and the crown used other means to gather data on population there. So this observation highlights this performative meaning of the census, alongside with its practical uses. Being counted on the census meant having a place both in the imperial project and within the colonial society. The census brought order, as the planters were enumerated following the most important hierarchical order of the society, race. The masters were listed on one side of the sheet of paper, while the slaves were listed at the back, sometimes not even nominatively. In comparison, in the kingdom, the census process brought disorder. For example, the nobles complained in the city of Bastia, Corsica, that they had to be listed on the same page next to their domestics and communal neighbors. So what they did is that they actually modified the pre-printed books sent from their side and crossed the total column and replaced it with the mentioned condition of the families in a separated book with only the nobles in it. But for the colonies, the final chart, which can actually be seen as a map and number, never mention the church or the noble condition of the inhabitant. So one can read this chart as well as a clear mirror of the type of colonial society the crown chose to promote in the second half of the 18th century. A slave society where inhabitants are settled landowners producing colonial goods to be exported. After 1763, the crown continued to ask for small modification of the census subcategories, mostly to manage affairs related to slavery. It is very visible at the end of the 1780s, where the crown tries to reform the legislation regarding plantation managers. Subcategories were therefore added in the final charts to enumerate white workers who were not owning the land and plantation, and they also asked to hold them to hold a precise monthly account regarding the births and deaths of slaves and sometimes horses or large cattle in booklets that they had to copy and hand over the authorities at the time of the census. So I could only retrieve one example of those booklets. This is for a Saint-Domingue plantation owned by the family Gavriloff. So to conclude, as the French metropolitan population was finally extensively and regularly enumerated under Napoleon's reign, the ancient census practice was perpetuated in the Caribbean throughout most of the 19th century. The French Caribbean island became known as Vieille Colonie, literally old colonies, after the Haitian independence and the beginning of the new colonial era in Africa during the time of the Bourbon Reformation. With the Mascarene Islands, they represented the center of the colonies under the French rule, where a large part of the population was enslaved. So as soon as the wars and trouble caused by the revolution conflicts with the British occupation of Martinique again, so as soon as those troubles stopped and a stable government was back in each island, a population census is sent in Paris. So this is the example for Martinique in 1805. And it actually continues until the actual abolition of slavery in 1848. The one for Guadeloupe and Martinique were lost due to natural disaster, but the censuses of La Réunion were preserved, and I could recover some preliminary documents used to craft the census in Martinique and Guadeloupe. So mostly forms filled out by planters. You can see that the document bears the exact same design, even though the use of pre-printed forms seems to become more and more common. So this is an example for the parish of Lamentin in Martinique in 1821. So finally, it is striking to see that the administrative dissymmetry within the statistic practices born during the 17th century is perpetuated during most of the first half of the 19th century. Statistics in the colonies seem therefore deeply rooted in the colonial regime despite the revolution, and tightly linked to the institution of slavery. One can see a genuine continuity in the state practices to govern the colonies. If the colonial censuses levied every year do not seem to have influenced the quinquennial census implemented by Napoleon, it is striking to see that a variety of actors serving the state, such as Moreau de Joannès, or also the Minister of the Marine in 1814, Malègue, had served the king in the Caribbean in the last decade of the regime. And in spite of a real purge of instant servants of the king within the administration, clerks, but also colonial administrators managed to secure and to engage in public service under the successive regimes at the turn of the century. I therefore argue that the tools of government developed in the colonies during the old regime maintained themselves and had some echoes in the decision made in the 19th century regarding colonial and national statistical matters, thanks to an administrative porosity involving both actors and practices inherited from the old regime. There was no frontal opposition to the census per se, because it was an efficient tool of government which permitted certain equity for the management of local affairs, especially regarding the control and police of the slaves. By looking closely at the census process, one can see that planters and colonial elites resisted the census not for itself, but to oppose imperial policies such as taxation or administrative reconfigurations and hierarchies. How the slave reacted, appropriated, or participated to this process of enumeration remains a blind spot in this story. The only case I could retrieve what is from the archive is to be found in this ad published in the Official American. It explains that a master has lost one of his slaves named André, who ran away, among other things, with the previous year's census of the plantation. When he eventually got caught and was brought to justice, he explained that he took those documents in order to pass for one of the free people of color working and living on this plantation, therefore hoping to be considered as a free man. But it seemed that most of the time, the census process offered nothing to the mass of the population, the enslaved. On the contrary, it was used as a tool to control the freedom of the free people of color living in the French Caribbean during the 1780s by asking them, while they made their annual census declaration regarding their household, to add documents proving how they gained their freedom and if they gained it legally. And the same process was implemented in the kingdom after the declaration of the king regarding the police des Noirs in 1777. The Minister of the Marine, Antoine de Sartine, who was previously head of the police in Paris, asked to conduct a census of all, quote, the non-white people of the kingdom, and as a result, the slaves that were brought illegally in the kingdom by their masters, or free people of color who could not prove on paper or they were emancipated, were to be sent back in the colonies.
Thank you.